This episode is brought to you by The Jordan Harbinger Show. Want a new podcast to look forward to each week? One that's entertaining, informative, and packed with actionable content? You know you do. And that is The Jordan Harbinger Show, a top-notch podcast named Best of Apple in 2018, and who's only gotten better. Jordan goes deep with fascinating people, from authors and scientists to mobsters, spies, and hostage negotiators. During his discussions, Jordan pulls out tactical bits of wisdom for you to use to become a more informed, critical thinker. You'll learn and have a good time. He's very easy to listen to. My two recent favorites are Episode 972, Mustafa Suleiman, The Coming Wave of Artificial Intelligence, and Episode 843, Eli Honig, How the Rich Get Away with Crime. You can't go wrong adding The Jordan Harbinger Show to your rotation. It's incredibly interesting. There's never a dull show. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show, that's H-A-R-B as in boy, I-N as in Nancy, G-E-R, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
It's that time of the year. Your vacation is coming up. You can already hear the beach waves, feel the warm breeze, relax, and think about work. You really, really want it all to work out while you're away. Monday.com gives you and the team that peace of mind. When all work is on one platform and everyone's in sync, things just flow. Wherever you are, tap the banner to go to Monday.com.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 468, The Comics of World War II. Ever since there's been at least 3 people on this planet, one of them was lying, trying to convince the others to see things their way. It was no different during World War II, and no media was off limits in trying to get the American people to rally to the cause and, equally important, buy war bonds. A universal truth is that perception is reality, and the American government needed the people to perceive World War II a certain way. Yes, it was going to be long and many would die, many more would suffer, and this was going to cost a lot, which is not to be insensitive, but the country, the world, was trying to come out of the Great Depression and was sensitive to such things. Alas, the money for this war would have to come from the American people in the form of U.S. war bonds, and that idea, that fact, dominates all that follows. In a nutshell, bonds are debt securities or tradable financial assets. The government issues the bonds, the people buy them, there were various values, and in the future, say 10 years, the buyer would get back more than what they paid. The buyer invests in the country during a time of crisis and benefits from it. Win-win. The idea behind a war bond is that as the government is going to start spending a lot of money it does not have, the increased production and taxes collected from this could overstimulate the economy. So bonds allow the people to invest, help pay for the war, and yet, by removing that money from the economy, hopefully things will stay relatively balanced. Thus, taxes do not have to be raised, every politician's worst fear. Okay, that's enough of the economics lessons. Let's turn to the men and women in tights and capes. Back to perception is reality. The U.S. government needed the people to know that, yes, the next few years would be tough going, but more importantly, the American people, they were more than up to the challenge. Why? Because simply it was the right thing to do. As the saying goes, it's never the wrong thing to do the right thing. Not unlike a superhero. This idea, in many forms, was fed daily to the American people. But that was to the adults. What about the children, the nation's young men, which is where comic books takes center stage? Comics, at least in the U.S., first appeared in 1842, though in a very different form. Not until 1933 did comic books, as we think of them today, make an appearance. But just 5 years later, in 1938, with the arrival of Superman, it was clear that comic books had created their own universe, had become a thing of their own. Ironically, or not, comic books were not only covering events outside the U.S. before the country entered the war, they were taking sides. Comics showed Captain America punching Hitler before the U.S. was in the war, and Look magazine showed Superman grabbing Hitler and Stalin and taking them to the League of Nations in Switzerland. This was before the Soviet leader became the Allies' ally. This dip into international politics is extraordinary, as at least half the country at the time was out-and-out isolationists, while the majority certainly did not want to get involved in another European war. So, were comics the leading edge of morality? Not so much. Many of the creators or writers of these comics were Jewish, and they chose to use their positions to educate and warn the American people. And since it was make-believe and a distraction, it was a safe forum to put forth such ideas. This may be going a bit too far, but like the New Testament in the Bible, showing the ideal, merciful Christian, the heroes in the comic books showed the best that Americans could be: trustworthy, brave in the face of danger, and ever willing to take on evil, in whatever form. But then came Pearl Harbor. U.S. foreign policy changed overnight, as did the country, as did their perception. Suddenly, everything had a patriotic message. Stamps comparing soldiers to Minutemen, and of course, comics joined in. Batman had come out in May of 1939 and used guns his first year. He was fighting organized crime, and those guys were no pushovers. But Batman became popular very quickly, and the editor, seeing the potential, wanted to raise Batman and Robin above its pulp status. So Batman stopped using guns, which made how he was taking on the bad guys more interesting. Turns out, mostly with his fists. But his use of guns became rare, and he was conflicted whenever he did use them at first. Maybe this side of Batman appealed to the isolationists who still hated the idea of America joining the war. Either way, gun or no gun, Batman and Robin, along with the other heroes, stressed the importance of buying war bonds, that everyone could be a hero in their own way. But what about the children? They could not afford a $10 bond. That's where stamps came in. They started out at 10 cents, and the buyer would put them in a ready-made book. Once it was full, with any combination of stamp values reaching $10, it could be traded in for a proper war bond. Now, this child was on par with Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Daredevil, or Captain Marvel, whomever was their favorite. And didn't that make them a little bit of a hero too? That's what all the media was saying. Back to Batman, alas, even heroes are nothing more than playthings to larger events. As 1942 was hard for the Allies, by 1943, Batman can once again be seen with a weapon. Only this time, reflecting the constant vigilance that was needed, he's now firing a machine gun, with Robin feeding in bullets. Next, let's bring in Wonder Woman, who first appeared on October 21st, 1941, in All-Star Comics number 8. She was created by American psychologist and writer William Moulton Marston and artist Harry G. Peter. Now, this is where we have to walk a fine line, as the World War II podcast, as much as possible, is for the whole family, if you know what I mean. So, let's try this. Marston was inspired to create Wonder Woman by his wife, Elizabeth, but also his and Elizabeth's life partner, Olive Byrne. Next, the more you research their outside-the-lines living situation, the more you will see Wonder Woman/Diana Prince. For example, Olive had these distinctive bracelets that she loved to wear, and Marston incorporated them. Most people have heard of Wonder Woman, but they have also heard of Marston's other invention. They just don't know it. He created the systolic blood pressure measuring apparatus, an integral part of the polygraph, or lie detector. But back to the Amazon who flies an invisible jet. We all know her story. From the island of Themyscira, Diana was sculpted from clay by her mother, Queen Hippolyta, and given life as an Amazon, along with superpowers by the Greek gods who, obviously, were bored and having a slow day. But not until the 1960s would her Amazonian heritage come to the fore, with her tiara that could be thrown at an opponent and her lasso of truth and bracelets. Diana/Wonder Woman was no ordinary woman, obviously, but she represented Marston's desire to fight evil with love instead of fists, to which his wife said when he brought up this idea, "Fine, but make her a woman." So he did. Marston also thought that women should rule the world, and considering history, he might have been on to something. Hey everyone, Ray here. I've been using Yahoo Finance, our sponsor today, and like many of you, I think about my golden years, and I hope they're golden. I have a Roth IRA with Fidelity and another with Merrill, and I have consolidated them into one hub with Yahoo Finance. There, I have access to expert analysis to help me stay atop this ever-changing world. And with Yahoo Finance at my fingertips, I can focus on my goals of paying off my house and getting ready for, me time. And since Yahoo Finance has been around for more than 25 years, they know what they're doing. It's the #1 finance destination, with their independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. With a community of over 90 million users each month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. So, for comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the #1 financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. In 1943, the American scholar interviewed Marston, who said, "Women's strong qualities have become despised because of their physical weakness. The obvious remedy is to create a feminine character with all the strength of Superman, plus all the allure of a good and beautiful woman." I'll leave what he said about bondage and submission in another article for you to read on your own. But obviously, Wonder Woman's accoutrements, her lasso and costume, were a reflection of his life after work at the end of each day. Need I say more? She, Wonder Woman, starts out by winning the right from her mother to take crashed pilot and U.S. intelligence officer Steve Trevor back to the man's world so he could continue the good fight against the Nazis. And she herself will go on to fight Nazis, along with other colorful supervillains. And as she knocks a bad guy into next week, there's no damsel in distress here. Lastly, for the Amazonian, considering her gender, the fact that she's still, today, side by side with Superman and Batman says something about her identity and attractive ideals, regardless of her almost perfect physical form. Then there's the big man himself, Superman. Everyone knows his origin story. It's been done a million times. Each generation gets an introduction. So, if you're at least 6'1", blue eyes, dark hair, and young, just hold on. You may yet get a chance to don the red cape. Anyways, Superman was not only a Superman, he had a super comic, breaking records and smashing rules in a single bound. He first appeared in June 1938 in Action Comics #1. But he was so popular, he would have his own comic starting in the summer of 1939, just before the war in Europe got underway. Before Pearl Harbor, Superman, like Batman and Wonder Woman, was fighting crooks, or anyone who hurt the downtrodden. Again, this was America the idea, not the reality. As mentioned, since the U.S. was struggling to leave the Great Depression behind, the idea of anyone, cheating and benefiting from it really irked the average American, who had to play by the rules and earn his or her own way in life, which is one reason these heroes were so adored. They were simply justice. Of course, the term justice would take on a whole new meaning when Poland was invaded, Austria having already lost its independence, with many more countries to come. Further, Superman was an alien or immigrant, like all other earlier Americans, if one goes back far enough. But now that he and they were here, it was truth, justice, and the American way. So many of you are asking yourself, why didn't Superman just end the war? In the comic, not in real life. That explanation, and there was one, is a bit campy, but these were comic books. Clark Kent did go to a recruiter, but was so excited to serve his country that he accidentally used his X-ray vision to read the eye chart, wait for it, in the next room, and so he failed. He was washed out and not allowed to join the army. But don't worry, Superman never shrinks from duty. He will fly mail to the troops or help with KP. Besides, the U.S. soldiers were so awesome, so determined, so gosh dang American, they did not need the help of Superman. As for Captain America or Captain Marvel, they were given Nazi enemies to fight to help explain why they did not end the war on their own, but they too were fighting the good fight. Back to the war bonds for a second. Comic books weren't the only ones pushing the message to buy war bonds. Everyone was, even celebrities. They did radio and short film commercials for adults to buy war bonds, while their children got the same message in comics. Of course, comics also advertised cigarettes, so yeah. Yes, indeed. Celebrities like Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, Alan Ladd, Barbara Stanwyck, and Humphrey Bogart were just a sampling of those Hollywood elites who encouraged their fellow Americans to buy war bonds. If those names do not sound familiar to you, just go ask your parents. As there were several war bond drives during the war, some of these had themes, like one of them said, "Get Hitler's goat." The U.S. might have been an industrial giant, but someone had to pay, and it would be the American people. Other countries did the same, but as the U.S. spent $2 billion on just the Manhattan Project alone, the need for funds seemed bottomless. The Japanese used comics as well for the children and young men who were being called up. And as the American comics depicted an idealized hero, the Japanese version showed all of Asia dominated by Japan, but at the same time, protected or shielded from the white predators who had stolen so much already, and not just in financial terms. Comics were also used to try to push countries like Portugal into the war, but they steadfastly refused. As close as they came was in 1944, when becoming a non-belligerent, allowing the Americans to use an island for a naval base. When the war started, 15 million comics were published a month. 2 years later, 1941, 25 million comics were published each month. Even before the war, U.S. soldiers were into comics, and that only grew. The main reason for this was that the U.S. government bought tons, literally tons of comic books each month and shipped them off to the various fronts. These provided these very young troops with entertainment, but also improved literacy, a very real problem in the U.S. in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And soldiers got hooked. And as the stories and characters matured and became more complicated and layered, these same readers matured and began to have a wider view of the world, its interconnectedness. No, Toto, this isn't Kansas anymore, at least not only Kansas. No surprise, then, that the U.S. government wanted its own comic books. And as comic books selling war bonds, selling the idea of fighting had been around for years, the Office of War Information was able to hit the ground running. One thing the OWI, or Office of War Information, wanted to counter were previous comics that showed the enemy as lazy. Washington did not need its troops overconfident. So the Japanese and Germans were still portrayed as evil, but vigorously so. Then came the comic Joe Dope, created by Will Eisner, born in Brooklyn to Jewish parents. The family struggled financially, so Eisner sold cartoons to Wow, What a Magazine, and would go on to write and draw for them. Then came Pearl Harbor, and Eisner was drafted. Taking a rather circuitous route, Eisner would end up drawing images or cartoons for Army motors. Joe Dope, the character, gave the men a laugh. He spoke the language of the troops, but most importantly, showed the boys what not to do. Knowledge is knowledge, no matter how you come to obtain it. Another comic tried to teach Americans how to discern between Chinese and Japanese people. That one did not go so well. Of course, no one was more perfect to stir the country to buy war bonds than Captain America, and the American people felt a connection to his origin story. Never mind that now the U.S. is one of the leading superpowers. Because of its origin story, the U.S. will always see and enjoy thinking of itself as the underdog. Back to Captain America, he was created in 1941 by Timely Comics, later Marvel Comics. He, Steve Rogers, was physically frail but wanted to do his patriotic duty, so agreed to participate in a secret program because, he trusted the American government. See? Boy Scout. Now, he's the peak of physical perfection, not just because they got dreamy Chris Evans to play the role. Anyway, the American people may not all be soldiers like Captain America, but they could help by buying war bonds, the equivalent, relatively speaking, of being the frail Steve Rogers. For Captain America's creators, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, there was no middle ground when it came to evil, certainly Hitler's brand of evil. Forget the isolationists, forget the non-interventionists, forget the American Bund. Evil was to be punched in the face, period. Side note, Joe Simon at first wanted to call this character Super American, but that was a bit close to the uber nationalism of Nazism. Besides, weren't there enough supers? And Roger comes from the term message received, and he was made a captain, not a stuffy general sitting behind a desk. First coming out in December of 1940, Captain America got his own cover date in March of 1941, that is, put on the cover. Still, he was mortal, so a shield and gun would be his tools, besides his determination and super strength and dreamy good looks. Oh, and on his first cover, Captain America got to punch Hitler right in the face. And this was before Pearl Harbor, so much for not taking sides. Also, as Captain America was not Superman, he was given Nazi enemies to fight, like the Red Skull. So he fought in the war, but could not end the war himself. It would be the same for the Submariner, Daredevil, Human Torch, and Captain Marvel. Leaving the heroes to wash their capes for a moment, as the Allies survived 1941, got through 1942, it looked like the tide of war was turning, if not for, at the very least, the Allies were still in the fight. So in 1943, there was to be a big push. The Russians were coming back, the Western Allies had cleared North Africa, and they were on their way up the Italian boot. And that meant, you guessed it, another major push for war bond sales. At this time, the comics changed. There was more violence, if that can be imagined. Batman is getting darker, and before the war is over, he is giving a soldier a gun and using a bit of humor about it. That's not the Batman of today, but that's the Batman that was needed from 1943 to 1945.
Another day is here, and you're ready for it. What to wear? Check. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Check. Planning for what's next and how to save for it? That's where Bank of America can help. For your financial to-dos, Bank of America has experts ready to help get you closer to your goals. Get started at one of our local financial centers or 24/7 in our mobile banking app. Find a location near you at bankofamerica.com/talktous. What would you like the power to do? Mobile banking requires downloading the app and is only available for select devices. Message and data rates may apply. Bank of America N.A., member FDIC.
By 1943, with the Allies about to break the back of the Axis war effort, the U.S. needed more plane fuel, but the refinery workers had been going like gangbusters for years and were exhausted. They needed motivation, so the Petroleum Administration for War came out with Coming In on a Wing and a Prayer. This led to the Undercover War comic book series, And it was a huge success, as it simply showed these workers how important they were. One Jack Burnley cover in 1943, he was a writer and illustrator, shows a line of men marching. In the front of the line are militiamen from the nation's founding. At the end of the line are current U.S. troops fighting the Axis, and in the middle, connecting them, is Batman and Robin, also marching. Other covers encouraged victory gardens to help with rationing. So why do or did your grandparents take gardening so seriously? Well, here's a part of it. The same goes for rationing paper. Hey, if Superman tells you to do something, you do it. Speaking of Superman, he got a bit more extreme as the war neared its end, but not ending quickly enough for the American people. The cover of Superman comic number 58 reads, Superman says you can slap a Jap with war bonds and stamps. Another comic throws its support behind the 7th War Loan, and it reads, and it isn't Superman who's doing this, it's the American people. If you haven't picked it up by now, racism and jingoism intensified as the war went on. Eventually, though, the war does come to an end. The bad guys have been defeated, they will be judged, and the men in uniform, you could say their leotards, are handed in for civilian clothes. For the superheroes, however, they are no longer needed, and they like Douglas MacArthur, fade away. Superman and Lois Lane get married and have super babies. Batman went back to fighting the master villains of Gotham, and in 1956, Captain America gets canceled. But don't worry, he'll be back. Ironically, by the early to mid-1950s, the so-called Golden Age of comics, non-hero characters transitioned to mundane activities. With no evil left to fight, comics like Archie, Veronica, Jughead, and Richie Rich became the mainstream from the middle of the 1950s through the middle of the 1960s. What's that? Who? Sergeant Rock? You mean Sergeant Franklin Joe Rock, the greatest soldier of all time? How many World War II bonds did he sell? 0. Sergeant Rock first appeared in June 1959. But never fear, with the Cold War by then swinging into full gear, his message of bravery and taking the fight to the idiot dumb enough to even challenge the U.S. fighting man will last many a year and was one of my favorite comics, even though I didn't understand much of it at first. Needing the American people's money and enthusiasm, comics, read by roughly half of the nation in 1941, got into the act. The message was clear. Be a superhero in any way you can, even if that only means by buying war bonds. The soldiers, the other heroes, will do the rest. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. It was nice to do something a little more lighthearted or whatever, and I've got a couple of more, standalones for this summer when I'm on my vacation. So I hope you enjoy those as well. But we will eventually get to the Siege of Kiev. It won't be as long as the Siege of Odessa, so then we can get back to Moscow. Anyway, just shaking things up a little bit. Let's do donations first. Let's see who has donated. Derek McDermott. So thank you very much, Derek. I appreciate it. And Bruce Anthony. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And as far as my latest member, there is Gary O'Brien from Maynard, Massachusetts. So again, thank you, Gary. We're probably, I don't know if I'm going to start with Kiev next. I got one more standalone I might put out there, but I will have a few when I go to on my vacation this summer, which is coming up late June. Anyway, so hope you enjoy that. And to give credit where credit is due, the cover for this episode was created by, the main image was created by Cameron Riley, my podcast partner on our various podcasts, and then Paul Finch touched it up a little bit to make it more for me. So anyway, so thank you to those two gentlemen, and I'll see you as soon as I can with the next episode. Take care, everyone. And Excelsior.
Our kids have said to us since we moved to Minnesota, we are far more active than we've ever been anywhere else we've ever lived.
Moving to Minnesota opened up a lot of doors for us.
Just this overall sense of community, the values that, Minnesotans have.
It's a real accepting, loving community, especially with 2 young kids.
See why CNBC ranks Minnesota number 4 best state to live and work. A great place to work, an even better place to live. ExploreMinnesota.com/live.